Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports a variety of programs to spark interdisciplinary dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. I'm grateful to our audience that's here and to those who will see us virtually online. In 2015, the McFarland Center launched a global initiative called Catholics and Cultures to study the different ways that ordinary Catholics live their faith in particular cultural contexts around the world. Our capacity to understand and teach what it means to be Catholic for believers around the world is important as we prepare our own students to participate in and lead an increasingly global and diverse Catholic Church. You can check out our website, which features articles, photos, and videos of Catholic life in more than 30 countries at catholicsandcultures.org. We also have a YouTube channel with millions of views, something like 6 million views, which I like to impress my niece and nephew that I have all these followers and views. So now they believe I'm somebody. And a scholarly e-journal called the Journal of Global Catholicism, edited by our own Professor Matt Schmaltz right here. Today's guest, Jodi Mikalachki, recently authored an article for the Journal of Global Catholicism on fraternity, martyrdom, and peace in Burundi. And we're grateful that she's able to join us today to share and discuss her research on how 40 martyrs of Buta have helped shape Catholic and national identity since Burundi's civil war. Jodi Mikalachki is Associate Professor of English at the University of Burundi's Institute of Applied Pedagogy in Bujumbura. I meant to ask that to begin with. She's also served as Education Coordinator for the Mennonite Central Committee. Previously, she was Associate Professor of English at Wellesley College, and she's written extensively on gender and nationalism. This year, she's a visiting fellow at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University. Her current project focuses on nonviolent responses to grief and loss in post-independence Burundi. In addition to her article in the Journal of Global Catholicism, which you can read online, her essay, Narrating Violence in Burundian Genocide and Civil War Literature, Pacifique Irakunda's Playing at Violence, appeared in Emerging Trends in East African Literatures and Cultures in 2020. She's also translated 2 Burundian works engaging with the nation's cycles of political violence, Zachary Bukuru's We Are All Children of God, The 40 Young Martyrs of Buta, Burundi, published in 2015, and Antoine Kabahare's Tutsi, In the Name of Us All, in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jodi Mikalachki.
Thank you. Am I being, yes, good. Thank you very much, Tom. And I also would really like to thank Matt Schmaltz, who so wonderfully encouraged me as I was working on my article and found well-informed reviewers. I don't know who they were, but they helped me make it a better article. We are also encouraged in Burundi to see how many people have downloaded it. Because this is a live case, the Martyrs of Buta's cause is before the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome. And it's helpful them to know that there is a global following for this story. So thank you for helping us demonstrate and measure that for them. I do want to bring greetings also from Burundi, particularly from Light of the World Buta, which is an organization, a peace and justice organization founded by the survivors of the Buta massacre, and from the Diocese of Bururi, where the massacre took place, and from my own university, the University of Burundi. So I chose as an epigraph something from Fratelli Tutti, Francis' encyclical on social friendship and fraternity. I think not only of the need to remember the atrocities, but also all those who, amid such great inhumanity and corruption, retained their dignity, and with gestures small or large, chose the part of solidarity, forgiveness, fraternity. Just before dawn on April 30th, 1997, Innocent de Iragije awoke to the sound of singing. He had gone to bed at 4 a.m., having taken the last round of a night watch organized by students at Buta Minor Seminary, a Catholic boarding school for boys. Burundi, their nation, was in its fourth year of civil war between the Tutsi-dominated army and armed groups representing Hutu political movements. The choir that awoke Innocent included men's and women's voices, as well as children's, and was singing a chorus he recognized, which translates as, "Everyone will be repaid according to their deeds." Nauzo buringero, nauzo buringero, nauzo buringero, yibikogwa yakodze. But they weren't singing it the way people sing in church. They were belting it out while banging on metal pots. Within moments, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs to the dormitories. Innocent heard someone call out, "To the seniors, they'll go for military service soon and attack us." As boys in the senior dormitory ran to hide under the beds farthest from the door, an armed group entered, shooting. Some students were killed immediately. Others were wounded, including Innocent, who was shot in the knee. After several volleys, the attackers ordered the students to come out and separate. Hutus over here, Tutsis over there. What they actually said literally was, ours over here, the others over there. And it was very clear to the students who was ours and who were the others. Under the beds, the boys reached for one another's hands. The order was given twice more. No one moved. Finally, under threat of being hacked with machetes, the boys who could still walk came out from under the beds. Lined up against a wall facing their armed assailants, they again refused to separate. A woman attacker who was giving orders opened fire. Innocent was hit again in the small of the back. Someone pulled the pin from a grenade and rolled it across the floor. From where he lay, Innocent saw it coming toward him, beeping. Scenes from war movies flashing through his mind, he smeared his hands in the blood that was already pooling on the floor and slid back under the beds. The grenade exploded. Boys fell en masse, screaming, blood spurting everywhere. The assault on the minor seminary continued for nearly 5 hours. Several times, the attackers in the senior dormitory withdrew, only to return and continue killing. During the breaks, students who were able tended to their wounded classmates. Pasteur Manirambona and Edouard Nkeshimana, who are now both priests, carried Innocent down the stairs and hid him in the outdoor toilets. Though a cold rain was falling, Pasteur removed his own t-shirt and used it to bandage Innocent's knee. And I would just say in passing that the boys who carried Innocent are a different ethnicity from him. Inside the dormitory, dying students chanted psalms, prayed the rosary, and made their peace with God and their classmates. Several were heard asking God to forgive the attackers. By 10:30, the latter were gone, fleeing the approach of the regular army. The soldiers wept at what they found. 37 students were dead and 40 others wounded. The junior dormitory was on fire. Some of the boys who had jumped from its windows lay injured on the ground. In the senior dormitories, bodies floated in what many observers refer to as a lake of blood. Yet by the time of the students' funeral mass 2 days later, accounts of their solidarity had begun to turn the massacre into a triumph, a glorious victory of love and fraternity over the ethnic manipulation of the Civil War. Students began to proclaim this message immediately after the attack. Seeing the seminary's rector approach the senior dormitory, Stanley Zonkitsa cried out, "Father, they wanted to separate us, but we refused." The rector, Father Zachary Bukuru, shared that testimony at the funeral mass 2 days later. All of you here, especially parents and friends of the deceased, do not think of vengeance, or you will dishonor the memory of these young people who died hand in hand, forgiving their assassins. I beg of you, ask for the grace to forgive during this Eucharist. Do not try to kill in your turn. You see where violence leads. Indiscriminate reprisals along ethnic lines were common during Burundi's civil war. Those who carried them out often accused the local population of complicity in killings committed by members of their ethnic group. The armed force that attacked Buta was the military wing of a Hutu political party, which would go on to win the first post-war elections and is still the party in power in Burundi. Among those mourning the fallen seminarians in 1997 were Tutsi military officers and politicians, including the Army Chief of Staff and the President of the Republic. Members of an armed Tutsi gang had traveled from the capital of Bujumbura with the intention of massacring local Hutus. Knowing this, Gaspar Nzeyimana, a local official whose son Pacifique Kanedzere had died from his injuries the day before, stood up after the burial and implored the president of Burundi not to retaliate against the population. "Mr. President," he said, "if I, a Hutu, were complicit, would I not have taken my son out? Do not take vengeance on this region." But it was really the solidarity of the students, Nzeyimana says, that saved the people of the surrounding countryside. "My children did not want to separate themselves into Hutus and Tutsis," he emphasizes. "If these children hadn't stayed together, I don't know what would have happened to Hutus in this region." Jacqueline Hakirutimana, a teacher living in campus housing, echoes this sentiment. "If the young people hadn't agreed to die together, it would have been a catastrophe because these children came from rich families in Bujumbura and all over. Those families would have come to take vengeance if the children had agreed to separate." Augustin Zohabonayo, another teacher at the seminary, also identifies the students' solidarity as critical in having saved the local population from massacre. He recalls that many of those who attended the funeral were armed, with some announcing their intention of killing everyone in the area, even at the sacrifice of a few Hutus who might be among them. "That's why we have the right to say that our students are martyrs," he asserts. "They saved a lot of people." I do want to make the point that Hutus and Tutsis were killed in the massacre, and Hutus and Tutsis helped each other. But in this polemical context of the Civil War, particular groups would decide that only they had been victimized. Because of the students' solidarity, there were in fact no reprisals after the Buta massacre. After publicly calling on the president to spare the region, Gaspar Nzeyimana privately appealed to Colonel Jean Bikomagu, the Army Chief of Staff, regarded by most Hutus as responsible for the assassination of Melchior Ndadaye, Burundi's first Hutu president, and for ongoing military violence against Hutu militias and civilians. Prompted by Nzeyimana, Bikomagu invited Tutsi gang members who had come up from Bujumbura to a nearby military base, where they probably thought they would be heavily armed, whence he dispatched them in trucks back to Bujumbura. A few days after the funeral, Hutu staff at the school were alerted that outsiders were preparing a list accusing them of having brought the attackers to the school. They appealed to Salvatore Niciteretse, rector of the cathedral parish in nearby Bururi, who persuaded the provincial governor and the commander of the local military base to intervene for their protection. From the president to the governor to the army chief of staff and the base commander, these men had been engaged for years in violence against Hutu armed movements and civilian populations. The fraternal love of the Buta students in remaining together as Hutus and Tutsis moved all these officers to break an established pattern of indiscriminate reprisals against civilian populations, particularly after school massacres. Now Bishop of Bururi Diocese, where the martyrdom took place, Salvatore Niciteretse was one of the first people on the scene after the attack, helping convey wounded students to hospital and sheltering their traumatized classmates in his own room that night. The martyrs of Buta were ordinary seminarians like any others, he points out. But then, in the name of their faith, they refused to divide ethnically into Hutus and Tutsis. Reflecting theologically on their witness, he observes that in the testimony of the Buta martyrs, faith is stronger than ethnicity. That's what Jesus asks. He who prefers his mother or father to me is not worthy of me. And there it is, in the name of this faith, another fraternity that goes beyond the fraternity of blood or family. What allowed the Buta students to make this witness to fraternal love during a civil war in which many of their families had taken up strong positions, a civil war that would continue for another 8 years after the massacre? And what allowed the students who survived the massacre to stay together and continue to resist the fratricidal ideology of that war, despite attempts by politicians, priests, and members of their own families to co-opt the Buta testimony for partisan political purposes? Nicolas Nyabenda is one of the survivors of the senior dormitory. He was slapped around by the woman leading the attack for refusing to confess what she felt to be his obvious ethnic identity, choosing instead to stand with his fellow students against the wall. During a break in the killings, he carried a wounded classmate to safety. After returning to help others, he was himself shot and barely survived, spending 2 weeks in a coma. Now a priest and professor of philosophy at Bujumbura Major Seminary, he asserts that the martyrdom of Buta is the fruit of an educative process built on human values and Christian values. In today's presentation, I will discuss some of the human and Christian values that led these young seminarians, so full of potential and with their whole adult lives ahead of them, to sacrifice themselves for the love of God and one another. I draw on 50 interviews I have conducted since 2018 with Burundians, including survivors of the massacre, parents of the boys who were killed, staff members at Buta Minor Seminary, diocesan personnel, neighbors and pilgrims to the Martyrs' Sanctuary, and Catholic intellectuals. I consider these Burundian responses to the students' testimony in the light of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis' 2020 encyclical letter on fraternity and social friendship. The Buta students' witness to fraternal love speaks strongly to Francis's desire for a new vision of fraternity and social friendship that will not remain at the level of words. If Francis is right that the first victim of every war is the human family's innate vocation to fraternity, then testimonies to fraternal love during war, especially civil war, are particularly valuable in restoring the human family. Life exists where there is bonding, communion, fraternity, Francis declares, and life is stronger than death when it is built on true relationships and bonds of fidelity. Francis also suggests in Fratelli Tutti that a country that moves forward while remaining solidly grounded in its original cultural substratum is a treasure for the whole of humanity. This afternoon, I would like to unpack some of the treasure contained in the cultural substratum of Burundi, particularly as it figures in enculturated Burundian Catholicism. After the Buta massacre, word of the students' solidarity spread quickly in Burundi and abroad. So did the title by which those who were killed would be known, the Martyrs of Fraternity. This is the Martyrs' Sanctuary in Buta. It was first used 10 days after their death when local Bishop Bernard Bududira announced his intention to build a sanctuary to the Martyrs of Fraternity. The building was financed by a personal gift of $50,000 from Pope St. John Paul II. Constructed in brick fired from local clay, the facade follows the arc of the hills surrounding Buta. The straight back wall lies against the twin columns of the tombs of the martyrs. Open to the sky, their red crosses lead toward an image of Christ rising over the seminary, surrounded by angels or perhaps martyrs, certainly Africans, and flanked by 2 scrolls displaying the names of the 40 martyrs of Buta. The painting is by the late artist Moise Lewali, who also decorated the interior. Lewali's altarpiece of Christ surrounded by the 40 martyrs dominates the sanctuary. The artist worked under the direction of Father Zachary Bukuru, the seminary's rector, painting the faces of the martyrs from school photographs. Because Lewali was Muslim, Bukuru also offered him some images of Jesus. The artist refused them with the words, "No, no, Jesus, I have him in my heart." And I must say, the first time that I beheld this image, I thought, I bet that's what he actually looked like. It is for their witness to fraternal love that the Buta martyrs are primarily revered by Burundians. They loved one another, says Teresa Banyankubusa, mother of martyr Alexine Dukumana. These children died for fraternity, for the love of God. They left this testimony to love and fraternity. Paula Nibigira, mother of martyr Jean-Thierry Arakadza, understands their testimony in similar terms. They died together, even though people tried to separate them. They were willing to die together. Umuvukano. Inscribed on the facade of the martyr's sanctuary, the gender-neutral term umuvukano translates as fraternity. Anthropologist Adrienne Habone explains the familial sense of the term as follows. Umuvukano comes from the verb meaning to be born together. So those who are born together are abavukanye. My brother is the one who is born from the same womb as me, Nhabona says, the one who prolongs the same human interiority as me, and with whom I thus identify, with whom I am one. Though Nhabona emphasizes blood ties in his discussion of umuvukano, he acknowledges that its virtues can also be extended to the solidarity of good neighbors, of friendship, and even social harmony in general. Indeed, Nhabona argues that Burundian humanism, or Ubuntu, demands that the spirit of family be without borders to render people capable of extending blood ties, of achieving a sense of neighborliness based on familial solidarity, of procuring an unlimited openness to every person and every member of society. In this way, one will be able to say to people of different origins and different ethnicities, Turibamwe, we are one. This articulation of fraternity as an unlimited openness to every person and every member of society is strikingly similar to Francis's call in Fratelli Tutti for a social friendship that excludes no one and a fraternity that is open to all. Nhabona's vision of a transcendent Burundian humanism is poignant, however, in the wake of Burundi's cycles of inter-ethnic violence. Perhaps for this reason, the Buta students' self-offering is particularly meaningful to other Burundians as a sacrificial witness to fraternal love that knew no ethnic bounds. Goteliev Nitsedzerana, mother of martyr Desiree Ndukumana, emphasizes the importance of the students' witness to fraternity in the midst of Burundi's civil war. Let's look at these boys while we talk about them. The children of Buta refused to separate by ethnicity, she says, though there was an inter-ethnic war going on in the country. Survivor and physician Melchior Ngowenubusa, who was among the students in the senior dormitory, also situates the martyr's testimony in this socio-political context. It's a message that demonstrated the importance of fraternity between members of a nation. In the precise case of Buta Minor Seminary, this fraternity demonstrated itself in a country where people were looking daggers at one another, where they were killing each other on the basis of ethnic affiliation. Fellow survivor and philosopher Nicolas Nyabenda argues that in the 4 years between Burundi's descent into civil war and the attack on the seminary, the students had been educated to resist the war's fratricidal ideology. After at least 4 years of attempted ethnic division and failed ideological manipulation, the 40 young seminarians testified that we were educated for communion in life and in death. To do that, it was necessary for us to give primacy to the other. This idea of gift, particularly the gift of self for the other, lies at the heart of Burundian understandings of martyrdom. Leonidas Nitereka, Vicar General of the Diocese of Bururi and an anthropologist, defines Christian martyrdom as follows. Christian martyrdom is the encounter between two dynamics of gift. There is Christ who gave himself for love, and this gift constitutes a call. So the martyr has the grace to respond to the gift with another gift. It is really the encounter between two gifts. In this sense, the martyr shows that a person is by nature gift, openness. The human person is this openness toward God who gives himself. The sacrificial gift of self for the other, Nitereka observes, has deep roots in Burundian culture. He links it to the Burundian concept of Ibanga, which he defines as a sense of responsibility, of things done well, which gives you a certain dignity. It's the idea of sacrifice in order to attain the status of a worthy person, a person of honor. You have a role in society, and so you play your role to the very end. Fellow anthropologist Adrien Habona defines Ibanga as the voluntary acceptance of a burden of responsibility, no matter how heavy. Habona goes on to characterize Ibanga as both the anchor and the summit of Burundian humanism, identifying it as a national value that can enrich the world. Though Ibanga was traditionally associated with a warrior's duty to face combat, Habona argues that now it is active nonviolence that must be privileged. But accepting death in the peaceful defense of a just cause, that must remain de rigueur, even if it is costly. With respect to the martyrdom of the Buta seminarians, Habona affirms that they prepared themselves together to testify to the very end to Christian fraternity. The Buddhist students' solidarity to the very end of their ordeal is often cited by Burundians as the seal of their martyrdom. Even after the attack had ended and the regular army came to transport the wounded to hospital, it was the students themselves who carried their injured classmates down the dormitory stairs to the waiting trucks. They were covered in the blood of their fellow students, recounts Henri Nizigama, a staff member who observed this operation. They would keep checking, is he still breathing? That's what proves their fraternity. One of the very sad things in this martyrdom is most of the boys bled to death. If they had received care more quickly, most of them wouldn't have died. And then when they would bleed to death, their heads would sink under that lake of blood in the dormitory. Sealed in the blood of their living comrades, the survivors testified to the end to fraternal love of their classmates. With respect to those who died, Cesar Sabushimike, another staff member on dormitory duty during the attack, testifies that I am convinced that each one of them was faithful to the end, even to martyrdom. So I respect each and every one of them. I knew them all well. Pierre Nyandri, father of Martyr Desiree Nduimana and a retired soldier, says that the Buddhist students are martyrs because they showed a spirit of unity among themselves without regard to ethnicity, and especially because, by the grace of God, they held out until death. Nyandri defines martyrdom in general as accepting the ultimate duty or charge one receives in baptism. And again, the word he uses for this duty or charge is Ibanga. Nukweme Ibanga warayaronse yabatissimo. Mark Bigirindavyi, who taught at the seminary at the time of the attack, also understands the martyrdom in terms of the traditional value of Ibanga, saying that it is a question of defending and not yielding, whatever the trials to be faced, something one believes with one's whole heart, something worthy of being safeguarded. Buta neighbor Gemma Murebgayira, who teaches at a nearby school, notes that in Burundian culture, quote, there are moments when people prefer to die rather than to default on their responsibilities. Her husband, Leonidas Nhibinonoye, who directed another state boarding school at the time of the attack, defines a martyr as someone who agrees to suffer for an idea by abandoning self to save a situation, adding that I insist on this idea of voluntary suffering to the end. Reflecting on the Buta martyrdom, Lidvin Bukuru, a neighbor who survived the general attack on the Buta area in 1997, ties this radical faithfulness to the cross. When I visit the tombs of the martyrs, she relates, I always think about the meaning of the cross, that we're all called to venerate the cross. There is nowhere we can flee the cross. On earth or in hell, the cross will always be there, and we must worship it, whatever the cost. For all these Burundians, parents, instructors, pilgrims, and neighbors of the Buta martyrs, martyrdom is intimately bound up with the traditional virtue of Ibanga, or fidelity to one's social commitments, whatever the cost. Faithful to the end, the Buta seminarians paid the ultimate price of worshiping and venerating the cross. As important as the Buta students' moral and cultural training was in preparing them to testify to fraternity, those closest to the martyrs insist on a divine element that allowed them to be faithful to the end. It is in this divine assistance that they discern the global importance of the martyr's testimony. Vincent Savimana, father of Martyr Jean-Thierry Arakaza, insists that in the student's witness to fraternal love, quote, there was a strength that goes beyond men. I don't know how they found the strength to die together. It goes beyond the will of man. It goes beyond. It was not their strength alone. There was a supernatural force that acted in them. I don't think it's just for the context of Burundi. It's a very unique case. You should look in other countries to see if there is a case like it. I don't think you'll find it. Gaspar Nzeimana, father of martyr Pacifique Kanedzere, agrees. Do you think it's normal without the work of the Holy Spirit? You hear gunshots and you go and try to escape. But the children helped one another. Whether the Pope accords it or not, they're martyrs. Kanedzere, this is his son, is my ambassador to the Lord. He represents me. He also represents the family and the nation, the whole world. There are 40 sons who are ambassadors. Reflecting on God's choice of Buta, a tiny community in a little-known nation in the heart of Africa, Nzeimana invokes a Burundian hymn about Bethlehem as a small town that wasn't very noble, but which the Lord chose to honor rather than Jerusalem. He reports that his late wife, Jacqueline Carenzo, mother of martyr Pacifique Kanedzere, used to tell him that maybe Burundi, maybe Buta was a small place where the Lord wanted the world, and especially the country, to see and think about what Imani Shaka, what God wants. Nzeimana's shift to Kirundi is telling. I interviewed him in French, but he said the last two words in Kirundi. In the Buta martyrdom, it suggests Imana, the God of Burundi from pre-colonial times to the present, reveals God's will to the world and gives the world something to think about. Burundian theologians amplify the parents' sense that Burundi is taking its place in Christian history through the martyrs of Buta. Venant Bacinoni, retired Bishop of Bururi, notes the growing inclusiveness of the Church's liturgical calendar. In the Missal of the liturgical calendar, martyrs have a very big place. They come from all countries, all cultures. Before, it was centered on Europe, after the Americas. Now they've added Asia, Africa, the martyrs of Uganda. Anthropologist and theologian Leonidas Nitereka elaborates on the inclusiveness of the Church's commemoration of martyrs. In the tradition of the Church, we commemorate saints, martyrs, even those who are geographically or chronologically distant from us. It all enters into the tradition of the Church. In commemorating, these are current seminarians on one of the commemorative masses for the anniversary of the martyrdom. In commemorating the Buta martyrdom, he adds, we want to make present the value that is contained in this event, because the fact of accepting death in the name of faith, agreeing to die for fraternity, that speaks. It's a value that speaks, that will remain perpetual, that will speak to man at any moment in history and in any place on the globe. Survivor Pastor Manira Mbona, whose brother Patrick Ninina Hazwe is one of the martyrs, so you can imagine the trauma he carries. He survived that carnage in the senior dormitory. His brother next to him in the family order was killed. Pastor Manira Mbona is now a priest serving in Italy, where he is doing graduate work in philosophy. As a Burundian, he says, to have a place where we testify that there were martyrs shows that our evangelization has borne fruit, not just for us, but for the whole Church. He speaks of the fraternal approach of Italians who invite him to share about Buta, as though this event went beyond Burundi. I'd been afraid they might not really understand, he adds, but I saw a real openness in the way they listened, a willingness to receive our story. The students who survived the massacre have continued to bear witness to fraternal love by staying together, first in a survivors association formed a year after the attack, and now as founding members of the organization Light of the World Buta, Lumière du Monde de Buta, which is open to all who share its mission of peace, reconciliation, and justice. Staying together after the massacre was by no means easy or inevitable. Newly discharged from hospital, Survival Nepo Birongwa, now a journalist and past president of Light of the World Buta, attended the Mass commemorating the first anniversary of the martyrdom on crutches. He recalls how vulnerable the survivors were to exploitation in the years following the massacre. We were still fragile, handicapped, young. When we organized a memorial mass at the Bujumbura Cathedral, we'd come out to find young people waving political posters. People would show up and take the opportunity to spread their own message to the audience, even family members of survivors. At our first commemorations, uninvited guests took the floor to say that the seminarians had been massacred by Hutu extremists. Now, we're adults, we're autonomous. We can tell people their message has no place here, even a priest. But before, when we were fragile and vulnerable, it was easy to take over our commemorations. We knew then and we know now that commemoration is very political, very sensitive. Physically vulnerable in their long recuperation from injuries that have left some with handicapped limbs, damaged organs, or bullets embedded in bones, the survivors also had the social vulnerability of children in a society that privileges age and familial authority. They learned early that the massacre of their classmates would be exploited for political purposes, becoming wary of offers to support their commemorations financially. Spiritually, they were also vulnerable to manipulation by priests who sought to frame the Buta story in partisan terms. On some occasions, priests prevented survivors from sharing their testimony after commemorative masses in the Buta Martyrs sanctuary, and enforced silence that Birongwa likens to reliving the event itself. And again, he's a survivor of the senior dormitory. He was in the hospital for a year. He still limps. This is not a sort of empty statement. The survivors had their own objectives in memorializing the deaths of their fellow students. Principal among these, says Birongwa, was the need, quote, to stay together for solidarity, mutual support, and especially for commemoration, to gather together around this event at Buta. So that's now retired Bishop Venon Baccinoni celebrating at one of the commemorative masses in the Martyrs sanctuary. Their main vehicle was the Catholic Mass, offered in memory of the martyrs of Fraternity on the 30th of each month. In their first 2 years, they would gather after Masses to share memories and reconstruct the day of the attack. What happened in the dormitory, Birongwa says, no one has the full story on that. Someone right next to you heard something you didn't hear. He also testifies to how the survivors' continuing solidarity helped them address their inner trauma. For those who stayed together to talk, to say things out loud, that allowed us to get past the fear, the hatred, the anger that we had inside us. The fact of staying together, both ethnicities together, allowed us to go beyond ethnic hatred. Innocent Ndayiragije, who survived multiple injuries in the attack and is now executive director of Light of the World Buta, confirms that gathering for commemorations allowed the survivors to transcend the ethnic manipulations of the war. But it wasn't easy. Buta was not a community of angels, he observes. There were boys from political families on different sides. 1 or 2 didn't want to form an association at all. Some asked, if the attackers had told Hutus and Tutsis to separate before they started shooting, what would we have done? In the end, they agreed to say if. They would focus on what had happened, not what might have happened. So I took this in 2013. Current seminarians, and these are minor seminarians, high school students, every Saturday a particular class has the role of going to the cutting garden and gathering flowers and making wreaths to adorn the martyrs' graves before Sunday Mass. And I always love in Burundi, you see boys and young men very comfortable with each other physically, making wreaths with flowers and holding hands. So these are 2 seminarians in 2013 carrying that out. And this can show you, remind us that we are talking about children, right? They were probably, especially in the senior dormitory, more the age of college students here because of the variety of reasons that education gets interrupted in Burundi, but they were still young. And in their own culture, they were considered to be children. The extraordinarily mature decisions of these young survivors, most of them still in high school or just beginning university, were the fruits of the seminary's efforts to foster a culture of peace during the early years of the Civil War. Innocent Ndayiragije, who was the incoming student president at the time of the attack, says the Buta students received an education, quote, designed to produce rational men who could transcend the differences there were during crises. People who could say, if Papa did this, do I have to do it too? We shouldn't be selfish and always crying, my ethnic group has suffered. I don't need to be my father. Students had nevertheless come to the seminary with strong and divergent ideas about Burundi's past civil conflicts, especially the 1972 genocide, which had occurred before any of them was born. After the October 1993 assassination of President Dadaye, Buta's rector, Zachary Bukuru, instituted evening meetings at the seminary so that students could express their anger, fear, and mistrust regarding events that soon escalated into civil war. Partly to release the tensions from these stormy encounters. And he says, they would be practically spitting in each other's faces at times. So to release some of these tensions, the seminary's leadership also brought students together in sporting and cultural activities. One of the most important of these was traditional Burundian dance. So this is one of the dances, the drummers' dance. Bukuru, who instituted the dance program, recalls that traditional dancing called us beyond ourselves into generosity, joy, relaxation, sharing, dialogue, and purity, an interesting choice of words. The dances brought us together in a single culture, uniting us in something beyond our differences in ethnicity, age, or social status. The dances tend to be regional in Burundi, and Hutus and Tutsis are mixed in together all over the country. In the polemical context of the Civil War, where speech was easily misinterpreted, dance allowed students to express their cultural unity non-verbally. Survivor Edouard Nkeshimana, who taught the Umuyebe dance of his native Migwa region to the fellow students, explains how that dance's powerful foot stomping grounded them in a shared ancestral connection to earth. So in that dance, they have things that rattle around their ankles and they're really pounding the earth. And he says, we really like to dance with our feet. It's as though we're packing down the earth. That shows that the earth is our mother. It's also good exercise. It expresses a celebration of life, showing that we're in good health, good shape. Nkeshimana, who helped carry Innocent Ndayiragije to safety after he was wounded during the attack, lost his sense of taste and smell for 5 years following the ordeal. So this is one of the commemorative masses, and Edouard is the first priest there. I don't know the priest who follows him, but behind that priest is Father Zachary, who was the rector at the time. Behind him is Father Oscar, who's the current rector of Buta Minor Seminary. And if you can see a white head behind him, that is the Vicar General, Monsignor Leonidas Nitereka, the anthropologist I've been quoting on Gift and Ibanga. So when speaking of the attack, Father Edouard says he can still smell the smoke from the grenade and the spilled blood of his classmates. Inside us, there lives a message that cannot be translated, he relates. What we lived through goes far beyond what we can say. Edouard was apparently the class cut-up when they were students. Among the dances offering nonverbal release and expressions of solidarity at the seminary, the Ntore, or warrior's dance, retains an important place in commemorations of the martyrs. Originally a spectacular military parade performed for kings and noblemen, the Ntore dance has been adapted liturgically to the Catholic Mass, where it is offered to the glory of God by young male dancers in traditional warrior's costume. That's dark, that's Christmas Eve 2011 in the Martyrs Sanctuary. Innocent Ndayiragije, who was a member of the Ntore dance group as a seminarian, describes his experience of joining in the post-communion dance at the 20th anniversary of the Buta Martyrdom in 2017. So again, the current seminarians then were dressed in costumes like what you see here. And as following communion, they were performing the warrior's dance. And Innocent was one of the people who jumped up to join them spontaneously. I asked him why. He said, "It was a Thanksgiving. I was shot in the knee and the lower back, but I can walk and play sports and use the members of the body that God gave me." One of the dances that really shaped me was the Ntore dance. And Ntore is a warrior for the king. He's dynamic, someone who is healthy in body and spirit, who can defend the king. If you're an Ntore, it means you're wise and good, truly sociable, someone who can bring people together. If you've danced that dance, we danced it when we were 20 years old, and 20 years later, we had to dance it again for the glory of God. Father Leopold Mvukiye, who survived the 1972 genocide as a minor seminarian, was a priest and science teacher at Buta Minor Seminary at the time of the 1997 attack. Reputed to have confessed the martyrs the night before they died, he left the dais of honor during the 20th anniversary Mass to join the young Ntore dancers. "I did it spontaneously," he again says, "to let out my exuberance, my joy." Dance is really the African soul. It's spellbinding. I should say that Father Father Leopold is on the National Council for Traditional Medicine and Science in Burundi. And he is a science teacher, and he runs a traditional medicine center at Buta, where I personally have been healed from intestinal parasites using herbs after all these Western anti-parasite drugs didn't work. So he's also speaking technically when he speaks here. Dance is really the African soul. It's spellbinding, captivating. It pulls you in. I had to be in the midst of my children that day. Rhythm is African. We make sure that everyone enters the dance. Even those who don't want to, we push them. It dispels our calamities, frustrations, repressions. Otherwise, we'd go mad, given the events we've had to endure. Meditating on the necessary transformation of Burundian society as the civil war neared its conclusion, Zachary Bukuru, now prior of Mary Queen of Peace Monastery at Buta, also invoked the aesthetics of commemoration as a way of healing the nation. What symbols can draw together young Burundians who have survived our ethnic conflicts? What liturgy must we invent so that these symbols might be regularly celebrated and buried in our hidden memory, so that no one might again forget what makes us live together as a people? The survivors' faithfulness to one another and the memory of their murdered schoolmates, their persistence in staying together, quote, for solidarity, mutual support, and especially for commemoration, to gather together around this event at Buta. In other words, the survivors' Ibanga, their continuing commitment, is itself a liturgy in the fundamental sense of being the work of the people. Centered on the liturgy of the Mass, it grounds and makes particular the great sacrifice of love that the Mass celebrates and commemorates, that loving gift of self that calls and empowers Christians to live together as people of God. 15 years after the attack, the survivors refounded their association as an organization open to anyone who shares their mission of peaceful solidarity. It was to say, I'm quoting here, it was to say that if it remained a survivors' association, it wouldn't last long, explains President and Chair of the Board Eric Nkengurutse. So we created Light of the World Buta after this light that blazed at Buta. Now there are women who have joined, families. Soon it will be up to our children to keep it going. Light of the World Buta has participated with other organizations in supporting the work of Burundi's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and other transitional justice projects, and is also collaborating with the Diocese of Bururi to prepare the Silver Jubilee of the Martyrs of Fraternity in 2013. A quarter century after their great ordeal, a group of once fragile, handicapped youth has come of age. Through their ongoing witness to fraternal love, they incarnate the testimony of their fallen schoolmates. Burundians emphasize the educative role of this testimony, affirming the paradox that fragile, handicapped schoolboys have become the teachers of the nation. Retired Bishop Venant Bacinoni acknowledges that these young people gave us a lesson in fraternity that goes beyond words to speak against all those who want to separate people. Philosopher Marie Goretti Nizigiyimana asserts that it is a lesson for all Burundians, revealing the shared nature of suffering during periods of national conflict. These children who died speak to us. When they testified for fraternity, they were all called to testify together. If there is a problem in the country, it cannot strike one ethnicity alone. There are always victims on all sides. For survivor and physician Melchior Ngowe Nubusa, a board member of Light of the World Buta, the martyrs speak into the future of the nation, calling on Burundians to develop ways to live together and learn from the past. Through their example, the possibility of national reconciliation becomes real. The testimony of the children of Buta shows that the mission of reconciling the people of Burundi is possible. This is philosopher and priest Jean Bosco Habarugira. He's not from the region where this took place, and he teaches in the north of Burundi. The massacre took place in the south. But it's a very real thing for him as a Burundian. For teacher Augustin Zohabonayo, in Buta at least, that mission has already been accomplished. The situation that we live in today is one of great cohesion, following the example given by the students. Today, there's no going back on it, and many, many people in the Buta area have commented on this to me. Because people continue to try to foment inter-ethnic conflict in Burundi, but the people in that region cannot be moved. They will not get into it. As Nzohabonayo testifies, the Buta martyrs' witness to fraternal love is bearing fruit in Burundi. Bishop Salvatore Nicitereze observes that it is these seminarians who are helping us to live fraternity. So these are pilgrims. Most of these people walked overnight. They would leave at 11 o'clock at night in order to be at a 10 o'clock mass the following morning. Walking all through the night, they bring water and sugarcane with them. They drink the water, they eat the sugarcane, they go to the bathroom, and then they walk all the way back. Pointing to the growing pilgrimage movement from diocesan parishes, which unites Hutus and Tutsis in long journeys on foot to the martyrs' sanctuary, the bishop says, this is how blood poured out brings people together. While they were alive, they could praise the Lord, but because they died for a cause, they caused the Lord to be praised even more. Before, they were only 40 offering praise, but today they are thousands. They are purifying the site. And in particular, a number of these parishes are near the Tanzanian border that make this long walk. And the force that came and carried out the massacre at Buta entered from Tanzania and almost certainly followed the same path. So it's as though the pilgrims are purifying that route. Buta's secretary Barnabe Bizindavi, who was on duty in the dormitory during the attack, believes that the martyrs' witness is calling Burundians back to social values they had abandoned. The testimony of these martyrs is first to the Barundi, who have been in interminable wars, in a fratricidal war. It's a testimony of reconciliation, of a return to the message bequeathed by their ancestors to live in peace, in fraternity, in love. Survivor Pastor Manirambona recalls that when they were young, the seminarians dreamed of being doctors, teachers, magistrates. All these dreams have been realized as a single dream, he now says, the dream of uniting our country. We have received this gift. Grounded in the human and Christian values of Burundi, the Buta martyrs' witness to fraternal love in the face of genocidal violence is also a gift to the global church and the world. It exemplifies the love made possible by God's grace that Francis cites in Fratelli Tutti as the source of a social friendship that excludes no one and a fraternity that is open to all. Even as the human fathers of the martyrs insist on the element of divine assistance in their sons' witness to fraternity in the face of death, so Francis argues that without an openness to the Father of all, there will be no solid, stable reasons for an appeal to fraternity, quoting Caritas in Veritate to affirm that reason by itself is capable of grasping the equality between men and of giving stability to their civic coexistence, but it cannot establish fraternity. Bearing witness to the treasures of their own culture and an openness to the Father of all, the Buta martyrs do indeed establish fraternity. As we respond to the poignant grandeur of their testimony, let us also offer ourselves to the ongoing liturgy of establishing fraternal love in our own communities, the global church, and the world. Thank you. I just want to say this image is taken from one of the commemorative masses. So you see that there are little girls who are liturgical dancers there. And so, I don't know, is it your left, your right? I can never tell when we're looking at these things. But on one side, so there's a man whose hand is lifted very close to the camera. That's Andre Bizodza, who is now the president of Light of the World Buta. And past him, quite dark, is Nepo Bironkwa, whom I quoted quite a bit here, who's a journalist, although in the 2015 crisis, his radio station was burned and he got out of work there, but now he works for Caritas. They're very resilient, resourceful people, Burundians. So those are two survivors and two presidents of the survivors organization, Light of the World Buta. On the other side, there's a gentleman with his hand lifted also. All of these, they're not praying, they're dancing. I mean, I always say if Augustine said to sing is to pray twice, I think to dance is to pray. To dance while singing is to pray at least 6 times. So, and that gentleman, I don't know his own name, but he is the father of one of the martyrs, Gédéon. And he's seated on the side where there will be parents of the martyrs, and increasingly it's siblings of the martyrs, because the parents are becoming quite elderly now, and they can't always make the trip. And then you can see where all the priests are seated around the altar. One of the things I always notice, not just in photographs, but when I'm there, you know, when the priests are all there with their hands folded, they look like the painting. The boys look real. It's the boys who really look alive. And I think Moise Liwali, the Muslim artist, is one of the heroes of the ongoing story. And I'm just sorry he died before I could interview him. But I've seen his work elsewhere. He was trained by the White Fathers, the missionaries of Africa, and he's done a lot of church painting. Anyway, so thank you for listening, and I would be very happy to hear your comments and answer questions. Yes.
It sounded like some of it, I mean, these are kind of glancing references that you made to, I guess, the official process towards sainthood in the Vatican. It seemed, and maybe I was hearing you wrong, that there's some resistance to, like, an official canonization of these martyrs. Is that true, or is it am I hearing?
It's a fairly complicated process. So the Buta seminarians have been grouped with 3 missionaries, 2 Xaverian priests and a lay woman missionary with the Xaverians, and then they were killed in the Civil War also in 1995 or 96, so around the same time. But they've also been grouped with a Burundian priest, Michel Kayoya, who was killed in the 1972 genocide. So the whole group is being brought forward as the Martyrs of Fraternity of Burundi. And the process began because the Xaverians, whose founder was canonized in 2011, now Saint Guido Maria Conforti, sounds very vulgar, but they wanted to do their martyrs after that. And they have brethren who have been killed testifying to the love of God, the 3 in Burundi, and then at least 1 or more in Liberia as well. And I learned in this process only a local bishop can open a cause. So they approached the Burundian Council of Bishops to say, would you be willing to do this for our brethren? And I'm always forgetting their last names, but it's Father Otorino Maula, Father Aldo Marchiol, and they're both Xaverian fathers, and then the lay missionary Katina Gubert. All of them are Italians. So when they did that, one of the archbishops in Burundi said, you know, I've been wanting to open a cause for Michel Kayoya for a long time, this priest who was killed in the genocide, who's also the father of modern Burundian literature, who set up, you know, base groups among women farmers, who was a very visionary person, and who was often in conflict with leadership in the church and the state, as such people are. He was a prophetic figure, I think. And he was, one of the 150,000 or so Burundian Hutus killed in the genocide. So the Xaverians said, sure. And then I think the Bishop of Bururi at that time, Bishop Bacinoni, maybe wasn't at that meeting, but when he heard about it, he said, well, come on. I mean, the minor seminarians, really, whom we've been calling the martyrs of fraternity for 20 years now. So, which is interesting, because Bishop Bacinoni is a very soft-spoken person, by no means a pushover, but not assertive. So, but he did assert himself on that. So the Xaverians said, okay, we'll take everybody. In Burundi, there's great consternation about the seminarians going forward with Father Michel Kayoya. I personally revere Father Michel Kayoya, but he had a lot of enemies, and this is all within living memory. So there's some struggle within Burundi. To get a cause moving forward in the Vatican takes a lot of money, expertise, connections, and the Xaverians knew how to do it. And Father Guillermo Quadro, I think, Camera, sorry, who had shepherded through the canonization of their founder, was in charge of this. I met him a couple of times, great guy. He knew some of the Xaverians who'd been killed, and he really knew what was necessary, and he was really telling me I need written documents. It's great that we have all this oral testimony, but the Vatican wants written documents, and this is why Matt may remember my many times saying, so is the article out yet? When do you think, right? So, and thank you, because now it is. Anyway, Father Guillermo, very sadly, was one of the many older Italian priests carried off by the pandemic. So this all came to a screeching halt in 2020. And they have yet to officially nominate his successor, but there is another Xaverian father who's doing that work and who has told me how helpful the article is to him. So again, I thank you for that, both of you, and the whole operation of Catholics and Cultures. So there are all kinds of political things going on. There's also the fact, for instance, that the party in power in Burundi, it's their armed wing who carried out this massacre, and the very next day they claimed responsibility for it. So there's no going back on that. And the people in that party who are still insisting that they were fired on first, that the seminary was a training ground for Tutsi militias, that it was an armed depot. Nonsense, right? So there's a lot of politics swirling around this. And this is why I was saying earlier, as part of the research I'm doing is to think about the politics of martyrdom and how things go forward. Like I think of the martyrs of Poland, for instance, or the martyrs of World War II who were fast-tracked through under John Paul II, right? And to re-burnish the glow of the Polish church after the Holocaust. And so, and I am sure those people really did what they said. But anyway, that gives you some sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. I learned so much from the talk. It was particularly personally meaningful. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania from 92 to 94, and I worked for Burundi refugees.
Yes.
During that time, but I'm a psychologist here, so my other, obviously my new hat, which I've been wearing for quite a long time now, is I'm a psychologist and I study adolescent development. So I was particularly interested in resilience here and what we can learn from youth, right?
Yes, exactly.
I think here, one of the things that I teach about in my adolescent development class is how conflict is associated with identity, right? And so how polarization often happens when you go back, right, to your home, right? When you go back out to the rural areas where they were all coming from, right? And they're with their families. That's where the polarization comes.
Yes.
And then when they're together, that's where you humanize the other. When you're doing the dances, when you, and this is actually what I talk about this in the Israeli conflict, but you can think about many different conflicts where when youth come together and have the opportunity
Right.
to humanize the other and participate in athletics and do the dances. And one of the, I really appreciate when you talked about how they got to that point, right, where they felt that fraternity, right?
Yes.
It came from actually talking about it, like being out about, like, this is what you guys are going through. You're going back to your home. Let's talk about this, right? How do you build that sense of connection with other, humanizing other? So I'm curious to learn a little bit more about that, but also to what can we learn from this about polarization? Because
Right.
adults are the ones who are doing like this polarizing, right? And the youth are the ones who are willing to kind of move their identity and be flexible and think about what it means to be with another person, right? And to be among your,
Right.
to be one.
So one thing I would recommend to you is Zachary Bukuru's book. If you don't read French, I did an English translation of it. And the English translation is called "We Are All Children of God." The 40 Young Martyrs of Buta, and there's a chapter in it called "A Culture of Peace" that gives a lot more detail on the work that they did in the seminary. It also talks about the fact that at various moments boys wanted to go home, like groups of boys. All the Hutus were going to leave one day, all the Tutsis were going to leave another day. And the seminary staff's strong feeling was they had to keep them there, partly because they could be shot on the way home, right? I mean, there was a war going on. But also because they were very concerned that if they went back to their homes, they would be either forced or recruited into armed movements. And so they were trying to keep them together. But most of the state boarding schools, and the seminary was a state boarding school under convention with the Catholic Church, became monoethnic during the Civil War. One group or another didn't feel they could be there. Students killed teachers. People from the surrounding countryside came in and killed students. It was terrible. And these schools were targets of violence. So first of all, they were keeping them together. One of my interests in this, in terms of adolescent psychology, is adolescent psychology of boys. And what I really feel here, and this is part of what I wrote about in the article, is that this is a story of a masculinity that is rooted in fraternal love rather than aggression. And part of it may come from that freedom that the Burundian boys have. I mean, I've taught high school in Burundi, and boys will be doing group work together, and one will be sitting here and the other facing him will have his legs up over his shoulders. The first one is picking fluff out of the other one's hair. They're just very comfortable with each other in their bodies and feel free for these loving gestures. And to express love. And they greet each other by hugging, like not just once, it's the hug on this side and hug on that side and back to the first side, and then they smack hands. So there's so much touch. I feel also this Inhore dance. I mean, the Burundian dances that boys do are very physical. The drummers you saw, if you see actual Inhore dancers, I mean, they really like warriors. And they are leaping into the air, and their bodies are very supple, and it's meant to mime dodging bullets now, but in the past, say, spears and arrows. To show their ability to do that, they move together as one, so there's a grace and a suppleness, but also strength, unity, solidarity, perseverance, courage. These are all warrior virtues, right? But the Buta martyrs exemplified them by loving each other, right? So for me, it's because boys are targeted in civil conflict, or they're targeted in conflict, urban conflict in this country, right? Or conflict on reservations, wherever it is. Adolescent boys are targeted and get caught up in it very quickly, and it's very difficult for them to find spaces where they can step away from it. So, and particularly in genocides, in civil wars, they're picked up and recruited. My students, when they write compositions, they were younger during the Civil War, but they talk about how you had to be very careful not to stray very far from your home because you could get picked up by one of these various groups just to serve as a kind of kid carrying stuff, right? And there were children in the forest that attacked the seminary. By children, I don't mean teenagers. They actually were sending small boys under the beds to check to see if there were students that were still alive so they could finish them off. So I feel the seminary was so wise in keeping them there, keeping them together, and then they kept themselves together, and it was in a way more difficult after, as I described, because their families wanted them to take different positions. And one thing I really admire among the survivors is there are people who want to say, I think the real heroes of this thing were the Hutus, because they could have identified themselves and not been killed. And other people want to say, well, the real targets were the Tutsis. I have a young colleague. He came back from doing graduate work and met me, and I was telling him what I was working on. He said, the thing you need to know about Buta is they went there to kill Tutsis. So it's still very polemical. The survivors say, we stayed together. This is the point of our testimony. And our classmates died for that. And we ourselves, because they made the same choices, right? They happened not to die. But they made the same choices to stay together, and they know that that's their witness. So nobody's more of a hero or a victim than anybody else in this story. Thank you. Yes?
Well, so first of all, thank you so much for sharing this powerful, really heart-wrenching story. My question actually kind of stems from your responses to the earlier two questions, because one of the things I was wondering is why Buta Seminary was targeted in the first place.
Yeah.
Now, I know you mentioned that there was some suggestion that maybe it was an arms depot, and gave that as a kind of excuse for that. But then you also mentioned that schools themselves were becoming targets.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering why military operations would have looked to schools specifically, and whether there was any difference between, let's say, religiously affiliated schools and perhaps other schools in the area. So in other words,
Yeah.
why was Buta given this target status?
Thank you for that question. And much of this is in the realm of speculation, but these are the things that people have put out. So this was in 1997. In 1996, because they were basically the only state boarding school that was still operating with students of both ethnicities, the prime minister, Burundi had a president and a prime minister, visited them and gave them a prize, which was symbolized in a beautiful cow, right? So they became nationally famous for being united. And of course, there were people who didn't like that. We also know that the force that attacked the seminary, the CNDD-FDD, they had been pushed out of northwestern Burundi into what was then Zaire, now eastern Congo, by another Hutu rebel force. And in eastern Congo, where the Rwandan Interahamwe génocidaires, the Tutsi killers from Rwanda, were also hiding out, they went into training with them. And so that was going on in what we would call the fall of 1996. And then they went down the lake and crossed it, it seems, into Tanzania and re-entered Burundi through Tanzania with a need to show that they could do something with their training, right? And Buta it's 11 kilometers. What's that, about 6 miles, 7 miles from the biggest military base in Burundi. And it's the base most associated with the regime at that time, the Tutsi dominant regime that was responsible for the 1972 genocide against Hutus. So to pull off a maneuver in the backyard of that base was really sticking their finger in the eye of the military and the government. So that's another thought about why Buta. It's not the first minor seminary that was attacked. The one in that area where they had been driven out of Chia in northwestern Burundi had also been attacked, and they had succeeded in carrying off boys there. It seems that one of the reasons they wanted to separate the two groups is they were becoming a more sophisticated force and they wanted to train officers, but most of the people in their force had very little formal education. So they were looking for people, the seniors who would be nearly finished high school, would be capable of going for officer training. So it seems maybe one of the plans was to pull Hutus to come and go into officer training and kill the Tutsis. So these are the different speculations. Two former seminarians who had been kicked out for, I think they had outlawed initiation rites during the Civil War because they were getting out of hand. But they had continued to carry them out, and they were among 6 who were expelled for that. 2 of them had joined that force. And what the survivors say to me, let's call them Bob and Jack, because I always refer to them by their first names. They'll say, no one saw Bob there. We're sure that Bob wasn't there, no one saw him, but Jack was there. And Jack gave them all the intel on the seminary and how it was set up. They had an anti-aircraft gun set up on a hill. Some of those shots I showed you of the seminary sitting in the valley are taken from where that gun was. So there were personal grudges. But it's also quite possible that it was a case of, they say in French, indiscipline, that in fact no one gave the order for that attack. But it just, they had sacked a beer depot in the middle of the night. They were drunk, they were high. This is often the case, of course, with marauding groups in civil wars. And it's possible that they did it without orders. The person who was officially the head of military operations in that armed wing at the time had been the principal of a high school not very far from there when Father Zachary was the parish priest near that high school. And he has said to me, there is no way in the world that he gave an order to attack Buta. I am sure of that. So these are the various things that are floated. As I said, that force claimed responsibility the day after, and they have their things that they said that got considerable credence in European news outlets, actually, and are still believed by some. And you know, that archbishop who wanted Michel Kayoya to be included amongst this group of martyrs, he absolutely believed this. And then God, when the Bishop of Bururi died, Bishop Bududura, you know, they have, what do they call them? Bishop Administrator or something? So he was asked to take on this Diocese of Bururi, where Buta is, in addition to his other duties as the Archbishop of Gitega. Every diocese has a minor seminary. There was no way in the world he could go there without visiting the seminary. So he eventually had to go. And he went into that sanctuary, and this is one of the reasons I say Moise Liwali is so important. He was blown away. There's a Dominican friar who many think was responsible for circulating in Germany the story that the seminary was a training ground for militias. And he also, when he first visited Buta, changed completely. And I do want to say, you know, this was a terrible civil war, and politically, I am a pacifist myself, but if you're not a pacifist, I can understand why Hutus formed armed groups, and I mean, I understand it. So there are not clear good guys and bad guys in Burundi. We do? Okay. Well, but I want to say there are also great guys in Burundi, and there they are. And I want to say again, there's the Congolese historian Jacques de Pelchin who says that ethics are alive and well in Africa and are sometimes most strongly demonstrated in the places that seem most to have lost their way. And he cites Burundi and Rwanda there. And I really do think it's not the only case in Burundi, but it is a great and luminous case. And I look forward to its being recognized formally in the church. And once again, I would like to thank Matt and Tom and everybody working with Catholics and Cultures for helping us to get this story out to more people.